take your severance pay and get the hell out of here right now, Diana! Who do you think you are? A low-life black nurse to question this hospital's medical procedures? Do you think you're some superhero saving the world? Take a good look at your skin color and your cheap degree.
Diana bit her lip hard, her hands trembling with humiliation. Not stopping there, he stepped closer, lowering his voice with filthy, insulting malice.
Don't try to act so noble. There are a dozen people like you in this city ready to replace you at a wave of my hand.
If you know what's good for you, shut your mouth and get out! Before I ruin your reputation and make sure you never set foot in another hospital again. You piece of trash!
Just as he turned his back to walk away, Diana's phone buzzed violently. An anonymous message from a colleague popped up. The patient in room 414 just passed away. That's the third one this week. They are erasing the tracks. They fired her at 4:47 on a Friday because they thought that was the end of it. They had no idea it was only the beginning. The hospital is hiding a body count, and they just fired the only woman who can stop them. Drop a like and hit follow to see how Diana exposes the truth in Part 2. Atlanta, Georgia. 14 years earlier, Diana Okafor did not grow up wanting to be a nurse. She grew up wanting to be what her grandfather had been, refused the right to become. Dr. Joseph Okafor had applied to 3 medical schools in 1961. He had the grades. He had the letters of recommendation. He had the kind of mind that his professors, all of them white men who would not have admitted it publicly, described in private as extraordinary. What he did not have was the right skin color, and in 1,961 inches, the state of Georgia, that was the only qualification that finally mattered. All 3 schools rejected him. The letters were polite. They always were. Joseph Okafor spent the rest of his working life as a nursing assistant at Grady Memorial Hospital, doing the work of a man with half his education for a quarter of the salary, and he did it without bitterness, which Diana had always found more heartbreaking than anger would have been. He died when Diana was 11, leaving behind a photograph on the mantelpiece and a lesson she had not been old enough to understand until much later. That the system does not always deny you loudly. Sometimes it simply closes a door and waits for you to believe it was never yours to open. Diana's mother, Clara Okafor, had become a nurse the year Diana was born. She worked the night shift at Piedmont, Atlanta for 26 years, raising Diana mostly in the hours between midnight and morning, in the particular way of women who love their children, in the margins of exhausting work. Clara never complained about the margins. She said the work was the point. She said that what you did for people in their worst moments was the truest measure of what you were. Diana had believed her. She still believed her. She had come to Memorial Grace Hospital 14 years ago, 24 years old and newly credentialed, with her mother's work ethic and her grandfather's mind, and the particular combination of warmth and precision, that the best nurses carry the ability to see a patient as a complete person, while simultaneously tracking 14 clinical variables about their condition. Her supervisor at the time, a veteran nurse named Harriet Doyle, who had since retired to Savannah, had told Diana in her first month that she had a gift. "You listen to what the chart isn't saying," Harriet told her. "Most people only hear what's written down. You hear the space between." Diana had taken that as the highest compliment of her career. She still did. In 14 years at Memorial Grace, she had worked cardiac, oncology, and post-surgical recovery. She had held the hands of people who were frightened and the hands of people who were dying, and she had learned to tell the difference between the two, which was not always as obvious as it sounded. She had caught a medication error that would have killed a 67-year-old man with a penicillin allergy. She had noticed the early signs of sepsis in a patient whose chart showed nothing alarming. She had, twice, asked a doctor to reconsider a decision, been overruled, and been proven right within 24 hours. The second time, the doctor had been Dr. Elliot Marsh. Marsh was 55 years old, and the kind of surgeon that teaching hospitals built their reputations around. He had been at Memorial Grace for 11 years. He had a named fellowship, a research grant, and a photograph with the governor on the wall of his office. His complication rates were published in the hospital's annual report as evidence of excellence, and his name appeared in the acknowledgments of 3 surgical textbooks. The board of directors spoke of him the way people speak of a valuable and temperamental piece of infrastructure, with a mixture of pride and anxiety, the awareness that his presence made the institution look good and his absence would be expensive. He was also, Diana had understood within her first year of working under him, a man who did not tolerate disagreement from nurses. From residents he tolerated it slightly more, because residents were on a path toward becoming doctors, and doctors were his professional equals, in a way that nurses, in Elliot Marsh's internal hierarchy, were not. When Diana had questioned his dosage calculation on a post-surgical patient quietly, professionally, in the hallway outside the room, he had looked at her with an expression she would spend years trying to describe accurately. It was not anger, exactly. It was the look of a man who has been interrupted by something that should not have been capable of interrupting him. He changed the dosage. He did not acknowledge that she had been right to question it. She had filed the interaction away in the part of her mind where she kept things that required watching. For 12 years, they had maintained a professional distance that functioned well enough. Diana did her work. Marsh did his. The overlap was limited to the post-surgical floor, where Diana's job was to monitor the patients who came out of Marsh's operating room and ensure their recovery proceeded correctly. It was detailed, demanding work, and she was good at it, and for 12 years the system had held. Then, 8 months ago, Thomas Bryson came in for a cardiac bypass. He was 58 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Decatur, with a wife named Patricia and 2 adult children, and the kind of easy laugh that made everyone around him feel slightly more comfortable. Diana had admitted him on a Wednesday morning, gone through his medications with him, answered his questions about recovery time with the careful patience she brought to every patient who was frightened. He had been nervous in the particular way of a man who was trying not to show it, and she had recognized the effort and honored it by treating him as though his composure were real. The surgery was scheduled for Thursday. Marsh performed it. Thomas Bryson never left the ICU. He died on a Sunday, 4 days after surgery, from complications that the official report attributed to pre-existing cardiac weakness. Diana had read the report 3 times. She had looked at Thomas Bryson's pre-surgical workup, his vitals during recovery, the notes from the ICU nurses who monitored him in his final hours. Something in the space between the words did not match. She could not have said then exactly what it was. It was the thing Harriet Doyle had described 14 years ago, the sound of what the chart was not saying, a timing discrepancy, a notation that appeared in the record 12 hours after it should have been entered, a gap where there should have been documentation of a decision. Diana wrote it down in the small notebook she kept in the left pocket of her scrubs. She had kept such a notebook for 14 years. Every shift, every patient, brief clinical notes in her own handwriting, dates and times and observations that did not always make it into official records. It was a habit her mother had taught her, and Harriet Doyle had reinforced. The official record belonged to the institution. The notebook belonged to her. She wrote down what she had noticed about Thomas Bryson's file, and she turned to the next page, and she went back to work. She did not know yet that she was beginning something. She only knew that something had not been said that should have been, and that she was, as she had always been, the kind of woman who heard the silence. The second patient was named Miriam Foster. Diana learned this 6 weeks after Thomas Bryson died, on a Tuesday morning when she came on shift and found a new name on the post-surgical board in the recovery wing. Miriam Foster, 61, retired librarian from Sandy Springs. Coronary artery bypass, performed by Dr. Elliot Marsh the previous afternoon. Admitted to recovery at 6:14 p.m. vitals, stable at handoff. Diana checked her chart during morning rounds and felt nothing unusual. The surgery notes were clean. The recovery observations were consistent. Miriam Foster was awake, slightly groggy from anesthesia, and asking when she could eat something. Soon, Diana told her, checking her IV line. "How's your pain level?" "A 4, maybe," Miriam said. "I've had worse. I broke my wrist in 1987, and that was a solid 8. She smiled at her own joke, and Diana smiled back. And the interaction was ordinary in the way that good nursing care is almost always ordinary, quiet, specific, unremarkable to anyone who did not understand how much precision the unremarkable required. Miriam Foster was transferred to a standard recovery room on Wednesday. She was back in the ICU by Friday. The deterioration had been rapid, and according to the attending notes, unexpected. Her cardiac function had declined sharply Thursday night. The ICU team had intervened aggressively. The notes described a patient who had been stable and then suddenly was not, in the way that post-surgical complications sometimes appeared without warning. Diana read the notes on her break, standing at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee she forgot to drink. She read them the way she had read Thomas Bryson's records, carefully, with the part of her mind that listened for what was not being said. The timing was wrong again, not dramatically, not in a way that would have jumped out at a casual reader, or even at a doctor reviewing the chart quickly between procedures. But Diana had spent 14 years reading post-surgical recovery notes, and she knew their rhythm the way a musician knows a familiar piece well enough to hear when a note had been moved, when a rest had been inserted where there should have been sound. The documentation of Miriam Foster's Thursday night decline had been entered into the system at 11:42 p.m. The ICU admission had been logged at 11:08 p.m. 34 minutes of record that described the lead-up to a crisis had been entered after the crisis had already been officially documented as having begun. Someone had written the history after the fact. Diana set down her coffee cup and opened her notebook. She wrote the times. She wrote the discrepancy. She drew a small arrow between the two entries, the way she had learned to mark things that required follow-up. Then she turned back 2 pages and looked at the notation she had made about Thomas Bryson's file 6 weeks earlier. The same pattern. Different patient, different date, same architecture of documentation that did not quite match the sequence of events it claimed to describe. She sat with that for a long moment in the quiet of the nurse's station. Then she went to find Carol Henning. Carol was the head nurse of the surgical floor, a position she had held for 9 years. She was 53, efficient, and possessed of the particular manner of someone who had maintained order in a complex environment for long enough that order had become, for her, an end in itself rather than a means to one. She kept the floor running smoothly. She resolved conflicts quickly. She did not, in Diana's 14 years of observation, enjoy complications. Diana laid out what she had noticed. She kept it factual and briefed the timing discrepancies. The pattern across 2 patients. The documentation that appeared to have been entered retroactively. She placed her notebook on Carol's desk, open to the relevant pages, and she waited. Carol looked at the notebook. She looked at Diana. She picked up a pen and set it down again without writing anything. "Diana," she said finally, in the tone of someone choosing words with extreme care. "Dr. Marsh is the most decorated surgeon on this floor. His patient outcomes are reviewed quarterly by the board. If there were a systematic problem with his documentation, it would have been caught. The review process looks at outcomes," Diana said, "not at the internal timestamps of individual record entries. You're suggesting a doctor of his standing is falsifying medical records. I'm suggesting the documentation doesn't match the timeline. I think that warrants a closer look." Carol was quiet for a moment. "What I think," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "is that you are a very good nurse who is about to make a very costly mistake. Elliot Marsh has been at this hospital for 11 years. He has the ear of the chief of medicine and 2 members of the board. Whatever you think you found in those timestamps, I strongly encourage you to consider what you're actually doing before you do it." Diana looked at her. "A patient may have died because of errors that were then concealed in the official record. Possibly 2 patients. Patients die after surgery, Diana. It happens. It is not always anyone's fault. And it is not always a conspiracy. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. I'm saying the records don't add up and someone should look at them. Carol picked up Diana's notebook and held it out to her. Take this home. Sleep on it. If you still feel the same way in a week, we can discuss it further through proper channels. Diana took the notebook. She did not go home. She went back to the nurse's station, sat down at her terminal, and pulled up every post-surgical file for patients who had been under Marsh's primary care in the past 18 months. She was not supposed to access files outside her direct care assignments, and she knew it, and she did it anyway, because the alternative was to do what Carol had suggested, to sleep on it, to wait, to let the week pass, and hope that the pattern she had found in 2 charts did not extend to a 3rd. She found 7 cases with similar documentation anomalies. In 3 of them, the patient had died. She wrote everything down in her notebook, her handwriting getting smaller and more precise as the list grew, the way her writing always did when she was concentrating hard on something that frightened her. Then Miriam Foster died on a Thursday morning, 48 hours after she had smiled at Diana and compared her post-surgical pain to a broken wrist from 1987. Diana closed her notebook and filed a formal report with the hospital's Patient Safety Committee. She used the official form. She cited specific case numbers, specific timestamps, specific discrepancies. She signed her name at the bottom, in full. The committee acknowledged receipt of her report within 24 hours, as required by policy. She heard nothing further for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Dr. Elliot Marsh performed 11 more surgeries. Marcus Webb was 31 years old and in his 2nd year of residency at Memorial Grace when Diana Okafor knocked on the door of the resident's workroom at 7 in the evening and asked if he had a few minutes. He had learned, in 2 years of residency, that when a senior nurse asked if you had a few minutes in that particular tone, careful, measured, the tone of someone who had already decided to say something difficult and was simply looking for the right container to say it, in the correct answer, was always, yes. Close the door, Diana said, and he did. She sat across from him at the workroom table and opened her notebook and walked him through what she had found. She did not editorialize. She did not use words like conspiracy or cover-up or murder, because those were words that made people stop listening and start defending, and she needed Marcus Webb to listen. She simply laid out the timeline discrepancies, case by case, with the dates and the patient names and the specific entries that did not match the sequence of events they claimed to describe. Marcus listened without interrupting. He was the kind of resident who had learned early that listening was a clinical skill and not merely a social courtesy, and he brought the same focused attention to Diana's notebook that he brought to a patient's symptoms, looking for pattern, looking for causation, looking for the thing beneath the thing that was being described. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How many cases?" he asked. 7 with anomalies, 3 deaths. "And the Patient Safety Committee? Acknowledged my report 3 weeks ago. No follow-up. No investigation opened. No contact from the Chief of Medicine's office." She paused. 2 days ago, I received a memo reminding all nursing staff of the hospital's policy on accessing patient files outside their direct care assignments. Marcus looked at her steadily. "They know you pulled the records." "Yes, and the memo was the response. That's what it appears to be." He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The specific expression of a young doctor calculating risk, not the risk to the patients, which he had already assessed and found unacceptable, but the risk to himself, which was real and not small. He was a resident. His future in medicine depended on the evaluations of attending physicians. Elliot Marsh was not his direct supervisor, but in a hospital of Memorial Grace's size, the distance between any attending and any resident was never more than 2 or 3 conversations. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Diana had prepared for this moment. She had thought carefully about what she was asking Marcus to risk and had decided she would not minimize it or pretend it was less than it was. "The OR logs," she said. "The system records surgical duration, automatically start time, close time, every equipment check. Those logs are separate from the physician's written notes. They can't be edited the way written records can, only accessed by people with OR system credentials. Which residents have, Marcus said. Which residents have, Diana confirmed. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for her notebook, turned to a blank page, and began writing down the case numbers she had flagged. His handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who had spent years compressing information into limited space. "Give me 48 hours, he said. It took him 36. He found her on the floor during a Tuesday afternoon shift and handed her a folded piece of paper without breaking stride, the way you pass something to someone when you do not want to be seen passing it. Diana unfolded it in the supply room with the door closed. Marcus had listed all 3 deceased patients with their OR log data beside the surgical duration recorded in their official files. The numbers did not match. In Thomas Bryson's case, the OR log showed a surgical duration of 4 hours and 51 minutes. The official record documented 3 hours and 40 minutes. In Miriam Foster's case, the discrepancy was smaller but present 38 minutes unaccounted for. In Robert Calloway, who was still alive in the ICU and had become, in Diana's mind, a clock she could not stop hearing, the OR log showed a procedure that had run 64 minutes longer than the attending notes described. At the bottom of the page, Marcus had written a single line in smaller handwriting than the rest. The extended durations correlate with documented complication windows. Someone is editing the record to remove the overlap. Diana folded the paper and put it in her notebook and stood in the supply room for a moment with her eyes closed. She had hoped to be wrong. She had spent 6 weeks hoping, with the disciplined hope of a woman who understood that the alternative to being wrong was something she did not yet have the full courage to name. She went to find Marsh. She did not plan to. It was not a decision she had thought through or prepared for. It was the response of a body that had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally reached the point where setting it down, in whatever manner was available, was the only option left. She found him in the hallway outside the surgical suites, reviewing a chart, still in his scrub cap. She approached him directly, which was not something nurses were expected to do with attending surgeons in the middle of a shift, and the breach of the implicit protocol caused him to look up with the particular expression she had learned, to recognize the interruption expression, the look of a man whose time was being consumed by something that should not have been capable of consuming it. "Dr. Marsh," she said quietly, "I need to talk to you about the OR logs for the Bryson, Foster, and Calloway cases." The change in his face was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. Something simply went very still behind his eyes, the way a room goes still when someone has walked in who was not expected. "This is not the time or place for a conversation like that," he said. "I've been trying to find a time and place through official channels for 6 weeks, Diana said. "The Patient Safety Committee hasn't responded. I've been advised informally to let the matter go. I'm asking you directly now because Robert Calloway is still in the ICU, and I believe he is at risk." Marsh looked at her for a long moment, then he stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice to something that was not quite a whisper but was clearly not meant to carry. "You are a nurse," he said. "You read timestamps, and you think you understand surgery. You don't. You understand vital signs and medication schedules and patient comfort. That is your job, and it is a perfectly adequate job, and I suggest you return to it. The OR logs are a matter for surgical review committees, not for nursing staff who have decided to make themselves the hospital's conscience." His voice had not risen. It was colder for staying level. "You filed a report. The appropriate people reviewed it and found nothing actionable. That is how the process works. Are we finished?" Diana held his gaze. "Robert Calloway is 64 years old. He has 3 grandchildren. If something happens to him that could have been prevented—" "Are we finished?" Marsh repeated. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she stepped back, and she went back to the floor, and she picked up her notebook, and she wrote down the date and time and everything that had been said, in the small, precise handwriting she used when she was frightened and determined in equal measure. The next morning, she was called to HR, not to discuss her report, to receive a formal written warning for accessing patient files outside her direct care assignments. The warning was the first document. She understood, reading it, that it would not be the last. 2 weeks later, it was not. The envelope was white and thin and carried the Memorial Grace Hospital logo in the upper left corner, and Diana knew what it was before she opened it. She had known since Monday, when Carol Henning had avoided eye contact during morning handoff for the second consecutive shift. She had known since Tuesday, when the scheduling system showed her name removed from the following week's rotation without explanation. She had known since Wednesday, when she arrived at the nurse's station and found her access badge had been downgraded the door to the surgical records room, which she had opened every working day for 14 years. Did not respond when she held her badge to the reader. The envelope arrived Thursday morning, delivered by a woman from HR named Phyllis, who had the expression of someone performing an unpleasant task as efficiently as possible and did not make eye contact. Diana opened it at the nurse's station because there was nowhere private to go, and she had decided, sometime in the past 2 weeks, that she was done arranging her responses to institutional cruelty around the institution's comfort. The letter cited 3 grounds for termination: repeated insubordination, breach of professional conduct, unauthorized access of patient records outside assigned care responsibilities. It noted that her conduct had been reviewed by the nursing administration and the hospital's legal department and found to be in violation of her employment agreement. It offered a severance package of 8 weeks' pay. It requested that she surrender her access badge and personal belongings and vacate the premises by end of business that day. It did not mention Thomas Bryson. It did not mention Miriam Foster. It did not mention the OR logs or the timestamp discrepancies or the formal report she had filed with the Patient Safety Committee that had received no response in 6 weeks. Diana folded the letter along its original crease and put it in the pocket of her scrubs, beside her notebook. She went to her locker. She took out her street clothes, her personal stethoscope, a gift from her mother when she graduated nursing school, engraved with her initials on the bell, and the small framed photograph she had kept on the locker shelf for 14 years. It was a picture of her grandfather, Joseph Okafor, in his nursing assistant uniform at Grady Memorial, taken sometime in the 1970s. He was smiling in the photograph, which Diana had always found remarkable given everything she knew about his life. She changed out of her scrubs. She put her badge on the shelf where Phyllis from HR could retrieve it. Then she walked back through the surgical floor one last time. She did not hurry. She had spent 14 years in these hallways, and she was not going to be rushed out of them. She passed the nurse's station, where she had spent more waking hours than she had spent in her own home. She passed the supply room where Marcus had handed her the folded piece of paper 36 hours ago. She passed the door to the ICU where Robert Calloway was still alive, still breathing, still the clock she could not stop hearing. She stopped outside that door. Through the narrow window, she could see the ICU bay. She could see the monitors, the IV lines, the particular stillness of a person being kept alive by machinery and medication. She could not see Robert Calloway's face from where she stood, but she knew his chart by memory. 64 years old, retired postal worker, 3 grandchildren whose photographs his daughter had taped to the wall beside his bed during visiting hours. She stood at the window for a long moment. Then she felt a hand on her arm, light and brief, and she turned to find Marcus Webb standing beside her in his residence coat, his face carrying the careful expression of someone who had been watching and waiting for the right moment. "I heard," he said quietly. "The whole floor heard," Diana said. "What are you going to do?" She looked back through the ICU window. "Right now, I'm going to walk out of this building. After that, I'm going to figure out how to keep doing what I was doing from outside it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a USB drive. He held it out to her without explanation. "The OR logs," he said. "All 7 cases. I made a copy before they downgraded your badge. I thought they might come for mine next, so I stored it somewhere they won't find it." He paused. "This is yours." Diana looked at the drive. She thought about what it had cost him to make it, and what it might cost him further if anyone found out he had. Marcus Webb was a second-year resident. His entire future in medicine was held in the hands of people who had just demonstrated exactly how they responded to inconvenient truths. "You understand what you're risking," she said. It was not a question. "I took an oath," Marcus said. "Same as you did. Different words, same meaning." She took the drive and put it in her pocket beside her notebook. The elevator opened at the end of the hall, and 2 security guards stepped out, not running, not dramatic, simply moving with the practiced purposefulness of people who had been given a task and were proceeding to complete it. Phyllis from HR walked behind them. "Miss Okafor," Phyllis said when they reached her, "I'll need to escort you to the exit." Diana looked at Marcus one last time. He gave a small, deliberate nod. The nod of a person making a commitment without witnesses, and meaning it more for that reason. "I know the way," Diana told Phyllis. She walked ahead of the security guards. Through the hallway she had walked 10,000 times, past the nurse's station, past the patients she would not be there to check on in the morning, past the wall where the hospital's mission statement was printed in large letters. Excellence in care, dignity for all. She did not look at it. She pushed through the glass doors at the front entrance and stepped out into the Atlanta afternoon. The sun was lower than she expected. She had lost track of time in the way you lose track of time when something is ending. The parking lot smelled of exhaust and cut grass from the median. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She stopped on the front steps and looked at the screen. An unknown number, a text message. "Bệnh nhân phòng 414 vừa qua đời. Cái thứ 3 trong tuần này rồi. Họ đang xóa dấu vết." Diana stood on the steps of the hospital that had just fired her, with a USB drive in one pocket and 14 years of notebooks at home in a box under her bed, and she read the message twice. Robert Calloway. The clock had stopped. She put the phone in her pocket. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine, her hands in her lap, looking at nothing. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write. The date, the time, the patient's name, the number of days since she had filed a report that no one had acted on. She was outside the building now. She had no badge, no access, no institutional authority of any kind. She had a notebook, a USB drive, and the precise and patient mind that her grandfather had passed down through her mother to her, the mind that had been refused its proper place once already in this family's history and had found another way through. She was not finished. She was, in fact, just beginning to understand the shape of what came next. She found the Bryson family through the obituary. Thomas Bryson's death notice had run in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution 6 weeks earlier, 3 paragraphs that described a retired school teacher who had loved gardening and coached Little League Baseball for 22 years and was survived by his wife Patricia, his son Michael, and his daughter Grace. Diana had clipped it at the time without fully understanding why, the way you save things that feel significant before you know what they signify. Grace Bryson was not difficult to find. Her name appeared on the website of a small civil rights law firm in Midtown Atlanta, listed as an associate attorney 2 years out of Emory Law. Diana called the office number on a Saturday morning, expecting to leave a voicemail, and Grace picked up on the second ring. "I've been waiting for someone from that hospital to call," Grace said, when Diana had introduced herself and explained why she was calling. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who had been angry for long enough that the anger had settled into something more durable. "Although I didn't expect it to be someone they just fired." "I'm not calling on behalf of the hospital," Diana said. "I know. That's why I picked up." They met the following Monday at a coffee shop on Peachtree Street, a neutral ground equidistant from the hospital and the law firm. Grace Bryson was 32 years old, with her father's easy manner compressed into a lawyer's careful precision. She arrived with a leather portfolio and the expression of a woman who had been grieving and investigating simultaneously for 6 weeks and had learned to hold both states at once. She ordered coffee and opened her portfolio before Diana had settled into her chair. "Tell me what you know," Grace said. "All of it. I'll tell you what I have when you're done," Diana told her. She laid out the timeline discrepancies, the Orlog data Marcus had copied, the formal report that had gone unanswered, the warning, the termination. She placed her notebook on the table between them and let Grace read the relevant pages directly. Grace read without speaking, Her coffee went cold. When she finished, she closed the notebook carefully and slid it back across the table. "My father was not supposed to die from that surgery," she said. "His cardiologist told us the procedure carried a standard risk profile. Healthy enough patient, experienced surgeon, routine operation." She paused. The hospital's official account of his death attributed it to pre-existing cardiac weakness they claimed was discovered during the procedure. "His cardiologist told me privately that the OR log shows his surgery ran 4 hours and 51 minutes, Diana said. "The official record documents 3 hours and 40 minutes. "Over an hour unaccounted for," Grace said. "In a cardiac bypass, an hour is—" "I know what an hour is in a cardiac bypass." Grace's voice was flat and precise. "I've spent 6 weeks learning." She reached into her portfolio and pulled out a manila folder. "I hired an investigator 3 weeks ago. I told him to look at Marsh's history before Memorial Grace." Diana leaned forward slightly. "Marsh was at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, for 7 years before he came to Atlanta," Grace said. "He left in 2012. His departure was described publicly as a voluntary transition to pursue new opportunities." She opened the folder and turned it toward Diana. "My investigator found a sealed complaint filed with the Ohio Medical Board in 2011. The details are not public record, but the investigator was able to confirm the general nature of the complaint through sources at St. Catherine's." Diana looked at the investigator's report. 3 paragraphs, carefully worded. "Sources at St. Catherine's Medical Center indicate that the sealed complaint against Dr. Elliot Marsh filed in November 2011 related to allegations of surgical negligence and subsequent falsification of operative records in at least 2 patient cases. The complaint was resolved through a confidential settlement. Terms included Dr. Marsh's voluntary resignation and a non-disclosure agreement binding all institutional parties. The Ohio Medical Board record was sealed by agreement." Diana set the report down. "He did this before," she said. "And someone let him move to another state and start over," Grace said, "with a sealed record and a clean reference." The coffee shop was filling up around them, the ordinary noise of a Monday morning. People on laptops and phones conducting the ordinary business of their lives. Diana sat in the middle of it, and felt the particular stillness that comes when something you suspected but could not prove suddenly has a shape and a history and a pattern that stretches back further than you knew. "Robert Calloway died Friday," Diana said. Grace closed her eyes briefly. "I know. I saw the obituary this morning. That's 3 patients. Possibly more that we haven't identified yet." 5, Grace said quietly. She turned to another page in her portfolio. "My investigator cross-referenced post-surgical mortality rates for Marsh's cases against the hospital average. Over 18 months, his rate is statistically anomalous. Not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger an automatic review, but enough that someone looking carefully would notice." "Someone did notice," Diana said. "And they fired her." Grace looked at her directly. "I want to file suit on behalf of my father's estate and the other families. I've already spoken with the Fosters. They're in." She paused. "But a civil suit takes time, and time is—" "The hospital is giving Marsh the Physician of the Year award," Diana said. "The ceremony is in 10 days. Grace was very still for a moment. "If that award is announced," Diana continued, "if his name goes on that plaque in the lobby with that title attached to it, the hospital's legal position hardens completely. They've officially endorsed his record. Every subsequent claim becomes a challenge not just to one surgeon, but to the institution's formal judgment. Then we need to move before the ceremony," Grace said. "We need more than the OR logs and your investigator's report. The Ohio record is sealed. The hospital will argue the timestamp discrepancies are clerical errors. We need something that shows intent, something that shows Marsh knew his surgical performance was impaired and operated anyway, and then altered the record to conceal it." Grace closed her portfolio and looked at Diana with the focused expression of someone shifting from grief into strategy. "What does impaired mean, specifically?" she asked. "What would cause those extended surgical durations and then be worth concealing?" Diana had been thinking about this for days. She had turned it over in the careful, methodical way she approached every clinical problem, looking for the explanation that fit all the observed data, eliminating the ones that didn't. Tremor, she said. If a surgeon develops a hand tremor, even a mild one, every procedure takes longer. Suturing takes longer. Tissue handling takes longer. The extended OR times are consistent with a surgeon working harder and slower than his notes claim. She paused. And a surgeon who knows he has a tremor has a reason to manage it. To self-medicate. Grace looked at her steadily. With what? With whatever is available to a doctor with prescription privileges and a reason to keep it quiet. The silence between them lasted exactly long enough for the implication to settle fully. If Marsh has been self-prescribing, Grace said slowly, there would be pharmacy records. Pharmacy records that Marcus might be able to access, Diana said. From inside the system. Before they realize what we're looking for. Grace gathered her portfolio and stood. The movement of a woman who had just identified the next task and was already moving toward it. 10 days, she said. 10 days, Diana confirmed. Grace picked up her cold coffee and finished it in one swallow, with the grimly practical air of someone who had stopped tasting things and was simply fueling what needed to be done. My father coached Little League for 22 years, she said, almost to herself, straightening her jacket. He never once let a kid walk off that field thinking they'd lost before the game was over. She looked at Diana. Neither will I. Marcus sent the text at 11:14 on a Wednesday night. Found something. Not pharmacy records. Something worse. Can you meet tomorrow morning? Diana was still awake. She had been awake most nights since the termination, sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook spread in front of her, and the USB drive plugged into her laptop, building the kind of documentation she had once built inside the hospital but now had to construct from the outside, from memory and inference, and the materials Marcus quietly passed to her through channels that grew more careful with each exchange. She typed back, 7 a.m. Same coffee shop. He was there when she arrived, already seated, with a cup of coffee he was not drinking, and the expression of someone who had not slept. He was still in the clothes he had worn the previous day, which told her he had come directly from the hospital, which told her he had spent the night there, which told her whatever he had found it during a shift and had not gone home afterward. She sat down across from him. He placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them, the same way he had passed her the OR log data flat, unhurried, the gesture of someone who had thought carefully about the moment and decided that understatement was the correct register for what the paper contained. Diana unfolded it. It was a printed screenshot of an internal hospital communication. The kind sent through the secure physician messaging system that residents could access but were generally too junior to be noticed using. The message was dated 8 months ago, 2 weeks before Thomas Bryson's surgery. It was from Marsh to the Chief of Medicine, Dr. Lawrence Aldridge, and it read, Lawrence, I want to flag something proactively. I've been managing some inflammation in my right hand for the past several months. Minor, controlled, not affecting performance. I'm handling it through my own care, and don't believe it rises to the level requiring formal disclosure. I'm telling you as a courtesy and a colleague. I trust this stays between us. E.M. Diana read it twice. Then she looked up at Marcus. He told Aldridge, she said. 8 months ago, before Bryson, before Foster, before Calloway, Marcus wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He disclosed a hand condition to the Chief of Medicine, described it as minor and controlled, said he was managing it himself, and asked Aldridge to keep it quiet. And Aldridge kept it quiet for 8 months, while 3 patients died. Diana set the paper down carefully on the table, as though it might break. She had spent weeks looking for evidence of intent, the specific thing that would transform a pattern of negligence into something more deliberate, more culpable, more impossible to explain away as clerical error or statistical anomaly. She had been looking for evidence that Marsh knew his surgical performance was compromised and operated anyway. She had not expected to find a document in which he said so himself. How did you find this? She asked. He sent it from the physician messaging system. Those messages are archived in the hospital's server infrastructure. The archive is accessible to anyone with system administration credentials. He paused. I've been doing IT rotation as part of my residency requirements. 2 weeks ago, I was given temporary admin access to troubleshoot a database migration. And you looked. I looked for messages involving Marsh sent in the 12 months before Bryson's surgery. There were 14. Most of them were routine scheduling, case reviews, equipment requests. He nodded at the paper. This was the third one. Diana looked at the message again. Managing some inflammation in my right hand. The careful understatement of it. The framing as a courtesy rather than a disclosure. The explicit request for silence. The whole architecture of a man who understood exactly what he was not saying. He wasn't self-medicating for pain management, Diana said slowly, working through it aloud. He was managing tremor, progressive tremor from an inflammatory condition, and he knew, 8 months before Bryson died, that his hands were not what they had been, and he kept operating, Marcus said, because stopping meant disclosing, and disclosing meant losing everything. They sat with that for a moment. Outside the coffee shop window, Atlanta was going about its Wednesday morning traffic. Pedestrians. The ordinary motion of a city that did not know what was sitting on a table in a coffee shop on Peachtree Street. There's more, Marcus said. He reached into his coat and produced a second piece of paper. This one was a pharmacy dispensing record, not from the hospital's internal system but from an external compounding pharmacy in Buckhead. A private facility used by physicians who wanted prescriptions filled without routing them through hospital channels. Marsh has been a patient at Meridian Compounding Pharmacy for 16 months, Marcus said. I can't access their records directly. They're not in the hospital system. But Grace's investigator can subpoena them in civil discovery once the suit is filed. Diana added the pharmacy name to her notebook, writing it in the small, precise handwriting she used for things that needed to be remembered exactly. She spread the materials on the table between them, the physician message to Aldridge, the OR log data, the pharmacy lead, Grace's investigator report on the Ohio complaint, her own 14 months of notebook observations. Laid out together, they formed something she had not been able to see when each piece existed in isolation. A complete picture, not of a surgeon who had made mistakes and tried to conceal them, of a surgeon who had known he was compromised, disclosed it privately to the one person whose silence he could count on, and continued operating while 3 patients died, and a nurse who noticed was systematically dismantled and removed. And above it all, Dr. Lawrence Aldridge, Chief of Medicine, recipient of the 8-month-old message, the man who had received a colleague's quiet confession and chosen to call it a courtesy rather than a crisis. Aldridge knew, Diana said. From the beginning, Marcus confirmed. She thought about the patient safety committee that had acknowledged her report and never followed up. She thought about the formal warning she had received for accessing records. She thought about Carol Henning telling her to sleep on it. She thought about the termination letter that cited insubordination but not the 3 deaths. The institution had not failed to act. It had acted deliberately and in a specific direction. The ceremony is in 6 days, Diana said. I know. She gathered the papers carefully, the way you gather things you intend to protect. She put them in the folder she had brought, the same kind of plain manila folder her grandfather had used to keep his important documents in the years before he died. The rejection letters from medical schools that he had never thrown away, which Diana had found after his death and understood, finally, as the record of a wrong that had never been righted. She was not going to let this one go the same way. I need you to do one more thing, she said to Marcus, and then I need you to step back and let me and Grace take it from here. What's coming next is going to be loud, and I don't want your name on the loud part until after the investigation is formal and you have some protection. Marcus looked at her steadily. What's the one more thing? The message from Marsh to Aldridge, Diana said. I need you to forward it to 3 places simultaneously. Georgia Medical Board, the Joint Commission, and a reporter named Sandra Kim at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who covers hospital accountability. She met his eyes. Do it from a personal device, not a hospital system. Do it tonight. And then go home and sleep. And when anyone asks you about it, you found the message during a routine archive access for your IT rotation, and you followed mandatory reporting protocols. Because mandatory reporting is protected, Marcus said. Because mandatory reporting is protected, Diana confirmed. He nodded once. Diana closed her folder and stood. She thought about her grandfather's photograph, still in her locker when she had cleaned it out. She had taken it with her, slipped it into her bag between the notebook and her mother's stethoscope. She thought about Clara Okafor working night shifts for 26 years in the margins of exhausting work, raising Diana in the hours between midnight and morning. She thought about Thomas Bryson coaching Little League for 22 years, and Miriam Foster smiling about her broken wrist from 1987, and Robert Calloway's grandchildren taping photographs to the wall of his ICU bay. She picked up her folder. 6 days, she said. The Physician of the Year ceremony was held in the Whitmore Pavilion, Memorial Grace's newest building, a glass and steel addition to the hospital complex that had been funded by a capital campaign and named after its largest donor. The pavilion had a ballroom on the second floor with a stage, a podium, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the hospital's manicured courtyard. It seated 300 people comfortably. That evening, it held 260 board members, attending physicians, department heads, major donors, and the kind of civic figures whose presence at hospital events was considered a form of institutional endorsement. Diana had not been invited. She was not a current employee. Her badge no longer opened any door in the building. She arrived anyway, with Grace Bryson beside her and a folder under her arm. Grace had filed the civil suit that afternoon, wrongful death claims, on behalf of the Bryson, Foster, and Calloway families, naming Marsh, Aldridge, and Memorial Grace Hospital as defendants. The filing was public record from the moment it was submitted, which meant the hospital's legal department had received notice at 3:47 p.m., approximately 90 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Diana knew this, because Grace had timed it deliberately, choosing a filing hour that gave the hospital enough time to learn the suit existed, but not enough time to develop a coordinated response before the evening's events. The lobby of the Whitmore Pavilion was crowded with guests moving toward the elevator banks. Diana and Grace walked in with the unhurried confidence of people who belonged, which was the only available option when you did not have an invitation. They were stopped at the registration table by a young woman with a clipboard. "Names?" she asked pleasantly. "Grace Bryson," Grace said, "attorney for the estate of Thomas Bryson, and Diana Okafor, registered nurse, 14 years on the surgical floor at this hospital." She paused. "We're here as witnesses." The young woman looked uncertain. She reached for her radio. Before she could use it, the elevator doors opened, and two people stepped out who Diana had not expected to see: a woman in a press badge and a camera, and beside her, a man Diana recognized from his byline photograph as the healthcare editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Sandra Kim had brought a colleague. Diana caught Sandra's eye across the lobby. Sandra gave a small nod, the nod of a journalist who has verified her sources and is prepared to be present when the story arrives at its conclusion. They rode the elevator to the second floor in a group of 6: Diana, Grace, Sandra, the photographer, and 2 board members who made polite conversation with each other and did not look at the others. The ballroom was already full when they entered, the room carrying the warm noise of an institutional celebration in progress, glasses and conversation, and the particular self-satisfaction of a gathering that believed itself to be honoring excellence. Marsh was at the front of the room, near the stage, wearing a dark suit and accepting congratulations from a small cluster of colleagues. He looked comfortable in the way of a man who had spent his career in rooms like this one, receiving the recognition he had arranged his life to receive. His right hand, Diana noticed from across the room, was in his jacket pocket. Dr. Lawrence Aldridge stood at the podium, preparing to begin the formal portion of the evening. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, with the practiced authority of a man who had run a major medical institution for 11 years. He tapped the microphone once, and the room settled. "Good evening," Aldridge began. "Tonight we gather to recognize the kind of excellence that defines Memorial Grace's commitment to—" "Excuse me." The voice came from near the back of the room. It was Grace Bryson's voice. and it carried the specific quality of a trained litigator, projecting across a large space without shouting clear, controlled, impossible to ignore. Every head in the room turned. Grace walked forward through the crowd, which parted ahead of her with the instinctive response of people who recognize that something is happening and do not yet know what. She reached the center of the room and stopped, equidistant from the stage and the entrance, so that the entire gathering could see her face. "My name is Grace Bryson," she said. "My father was Thomas Bryson. He died in this hospital 11 weeks ago, 4 days after a surgery performed by the man you are about to honor." The silence in the ballroom was immediate and total. Aldridge leaned toward the microphone. "This is a private event. Security." A civil suit was filed this afternoon in Fulton County Superior Court, Grace continued, her voice not rising, naming Dr. Elliot Marsh, Dr. Lawrence Aldridge, and Memorial Grace Hospital as defendants in the wrongful deaths of Thomas Bryson, Miriam Foster, and Robert Calloway. She turned to face Marsh directly. The suit includes evidence that Dr. Marsh disclosed a progressive hand tremor to Dr. Aldridge 8 months before my father's surgery, was advised or permitted to continue operating without formal disclosure, and subsequently altered operative records to conceal the extended surgical durations caused by his condition. Marsh's face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession. Diana watched from the side of the room, standing very still, as the last of them settled into something she recognized, the stillness she had seen in the hallway outside the surgical suites. The moment when a person realizes that the thing they believed was contained is no longer contained. "This is outrageous," Aldridge said into the microphone, but his voice had lost something. The ease of a man who controlled the room had been replaced by the tightness of a man who was no longer certain the room was his to control. Diana walked forward. She had not planned to speak. She had planned to stand with Grace and let the legal and documentary record do what she had spent weeks preparing it to do. But she found herself moving toward the front of the room anyway, the way she had moved toward Marsh in the hallway 6 weeks ago, not from a plan, but from the accumulated weight of everything she had been carrying and the recognition that the moment had arrived to set it down. She stopped beside Grace. "My name is Diana Okafor," she said, to a room that had not known she existed until this moment. "I was a nurse on the surgical floor of this hospital for 14 years. I was terminated 2 weeks ago for filing a formal report about the documentation anomalies in Dr. Marsh's post-surgical records." She looked at the board members in the front row, men and women who had signed her termination without knowing her name. "The report I filed identified 3 patients whose surgical records did not match the OR system logs. The Patient Safety Committee received my report and did not respond. I was given a formal warning for accessing patient files and subsequently fired." She reached into her folder and removed a single page, the printed screenshot of Marsh's message to Aldridge. "This is a communication sent by Dr. Marsh to Dr. Aldridge 8 months before Thomas Bryson's surgery. It describes a hand condition that Dr. Marsh characterized as minor and controlled. He asked Dr. Aldridge to keep it between them." She looked at Aldridge. Dr. Aldridge did. The room was absolutely silent. Sandra Kim's photographer was shooting continuously from the back of the room. Sandra herself was writing in her notebook with the focused calm of someone who had covered enough major stories to know that the correct response to a room going this quiet was to record everything and react to nothing. Marsh stepped forward from where he had been standing. "These are accusations from a disgruntled former employee," he said, and Diana recognized the phrase. Immediately, it was the same phrase the hospital had used in its response to her original report, which told her that the phrase had become institutional policy, the designated container for truths that the institution did not wish to process. "Thomas Bryson coached Little League for 22 years, Grace said quietly, cutting through the phrase like it was paper. "Miriam Foster was a librarian. She helped children find books for 30 years. Robert Calloway was a postal worker who delivered mail in the same neighborhood for 26 years. She looked at Marsh. "They are not accusations. They are people. And they are dead." Marsh opened his mouth. Carol Henning spoke first. She was standing near the side of the room, against the wall, a place Diana had not noticed her until this moment. Carol Henning, head nurse of the surgical floor, the woman who had told Diana to sleep on it and take her notebook home. She was 53 years old and had maintained order in a complex environment for 9 years by choosing, again and again, the path of least institutional resistance. She stepped forward from the wall. "It's true," Carol said. Her voice was not loud, but in the silence of the room it carried to every corner. "I was aware of Diana's concerns. I told her not to pursue them." She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at Diana with an expression that had shame in it and something else, something that had waited too long to arrive but had arrived at last. "I knew something wasn't right. I should have listened to her. I should have listened from the beginning." The room came apart at that, not loudly but completely, board members turning to each other, physicians pulling out phones, the carefully constructed order of a celebration dissolving into the urgent, disordered noise of people who have just understood that the ground beneath them is different from what they believed. Aldridge stepped back from the podium. Marsh stood alone at the front of the room, in his dark suit with his right hand still in his jacket pocket, and Diana looked at him across the distance of the ballroom and thought about Thomas Bryson's chart and Miriam Foster's smile and Robert Calloway's grandchildren's photographs taped to the wall of an ICU bay. She did not feel triumph. She felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally, in front of witnesses, been allowed to put it down. The Georgia Medical Board convened an emergency session 4 days after the ceremony. Diana did not attend. She was not required to, and she had learned in the weeks since her termination that the instinct to be present for every development in a long fight was a form of exhaustion that served no one. She sat at her kitchen table with coffee and her notebook and her phone and waited, the way she had learned to wait, not passively, not hopefully, but with the steady attention of someone who has done the preparation and understands that some things must now proceed without her. Marcus texted at 11:23 da manhã. Board voted to suspend Marsh's license pending full investigation. Unanimous. Aldridge just sent an email to all staff saying he's stepping down effective immediately for personal reasons. Diana read the message twice. Then she set her phone down on the table beside her grandfather's photograph, which she had framed again after bringing it home from the hospital, and she sat with the information for a long time without doing anything with it. Elliot Marsh's surgical license suspended. Lawrence Aldridge, who had received a colleague's quiet confession 8 months before Thomas Bryson's death and called it a courtesy, stepping down into the careful language of personal reasons. She had expected to feel more than she felt. She had expected something sharper: relief, or vindication, or the particular satisfaction of a long calculation finally resolving. What she felt instead was quieter and more complicated than any of those things. It was the feeling of a weight that has been carried so long that its removal does not produce lightness so much as the strange, unfamiliar sensation of your own body without it. She picked up her phone and called Grace. Grace answered from what sounded like a parking garage, her voice carrying the flat echo of concrete and the background noise of someone moving quickly between tasks. The civil suit had transformed Grace's life in the weeks since filing. She was handling media calls, coordinating with the Foster and Calloway families, preparing for discovery, and sleeping approximately 4 hours a night, which Diana knew because Grace texted at hours that no person with adequate sleep would be awake. "I heard," Grace said before Diana could speak. "How are the families?" A brief pause. Patricia Bryson cried for an hour. Then she asked me what happens next. Grace's voice carried something in it that Diana recognized as the sound of a lawyer learning, in real time, that justice and comfort were not the same thing. She wanted to know if it would bring him back. I had to tell her no. "No," Diana agreed. She said she knew that. She said she just needed someone to say it out loud. They were quiet together for a moment, the phone held between them, 2 women in different parking garages and different silences, thinking about a retired schoolteacher who had loved gardening and coached Little League baseball for 22 years. "The Meridian Pharmacy records came back in discovery," Grace said. Shifting into the practical register that was, Diana had come to understand, Grace's way of managing grief by turning immediately toward the next thing that could be done. Marsh had been filling prescriptions for muscle relaxants and a specific anti-inflammatory compound for 16 months. The dosages were, she paused, choosing the word carefully, inconsistent with standard therapeutic use. A pharmacology expert we retained describes them as consistent with someone attempting to manage progressive, essential tremor through pharmaceutical suppression. He was medicating the tremor to keep operating, Diana said, and the medication was affecting his surgical performance in ways the tremor alone might not have, Grace said. The expert believes the extended or durations reflect both the underlying tremor and the sedating effects of the muscle relaxants. He was operating impaired in two distinct ways simultaneously. Diana wrote this in her notebook, the small, precise handwriting. The Joint Commission opened a formal review of Memorial Grace's patient safety reporting protocols, Grace continued. They want to understand how a formal nurse report triggered a termination rather than an investigation. A pause. Your termination is part of their inquiry, Diana. They may want to speak with you. I'll speak with them, Diana said. I know you will. Something shifted in Grace's voice, a warmth underneath the precision. Diana, I want to say something that I've been meaning to say for a while, and I keep not saying it because there's always something more urgent to do. You don't have to. I do. Grace stopped moving. The parking garage sounds settled. My father trusted that hospital with his life. He went in there and he trusted the system, and the system failed him, and nobody was going to know that except us. A pause. You knew. You knew when you had every reason to look away. And you didn't look away. And you kept the notebook. And you found Marcus. And you did all of it while they were actively trying to make it impossible. Her voice was steady. The steadiness of someone speaking carefully about something large. My father would have liked you. He liked people who did the right thing, even when it cost them something. Diana looked at her grandfather's photograph on the table. It cost him something too, she said, doing the right thing. It just looked different. The Joint Commission's report, released 6 weeks later, was unsparing. It found that Memorial Grace's patient safety reporting system had failed at multiple levels: the Patient Safety Committee's non-response to Diana's formal report, the retaliatory warning and subsequent termination, the Chief of Medicine's failure to act on Marsh's self-disclosure. The report recommended a comprehensive restructuring of the hospital's nursing complaint protocols and the implementation of an independent reporting channel that bypassed institutional management. It cited Diana's case by name as the primary example of systemic failure. The Georgia Medical Board's full investigation concluded 2 months after that. Marsh's license was permanently revoked. The board's published findings detailed the progressive tremor, the pharmaceutical suppression, the pattern of documentation, falsification, and the disclosure to Aldridge that had been treated as a private matter rather than a patient safety emergency. The findings noted, in language that Diana read 3 times, that the evidence suggested the deaths of Thomas Bryson, Miriam Foster, and Robert Calloway were preventable. Preventable. The words sat on the page in the flat language of a regulatory finding, and Diana understood that it was the most honest and most devastating word the report contained, because preventable meant that the system had possessed, at multiple points, the information required to stop what happened, and had chosen to use that information differently. The criminal investigation moved more slowly, as criminal investigations do. The district attorney's office opened a file. A grand jury was convened. The process would take months, possibly longer, and Diana had made her peace with the pace of it, because she had learned in the past several months that justice and speed were not natural companions, and that expecting them to move together was a way of setting yourself up for a specific kind of disappointment. What moved more quickly was the civil suit. Memorial Grace's board, reconstituted after Aldridge's departure and the resignations of 2 members who had served on the committee that processed Diana's termination, approved a settlement in the 8th week after filing. The terms were not public, but Grace told Diana the number in a phone call made from a courthouse hallway, speaking quietly, with her hand cupped around the phone. Diana did not ask about the specifics of the settlement's distribution, That was between the families and their attorney. What she asked was the question she had been carrying since the day she had filed the formal report that no one had answered. "Is it enough?" she asked. Grace was quiet for a moment. "Patricia Bryson said something to me after we told her the number," Grace said. She said, "Thomas always said that being right wasn't the same as being made whole. But it's a start." A pause. "She said to tell you thank you. She said you didn't have to keep going after they fired you, and you did. And she wanted you to know that her family knows that." Diana sat at her kitchen table in the apartment she had lived in for 9 years, with her notebook stacked beside her and her grandfather's photograph in its new frame and her mother's stethoscope hanging on the hook by the front door, and she received Patricia Bryson's gratitude in the quiet of her kitchen and let herself feel, for the first time in months, the full weight of what the past several months had been. It was not relief, exactly. It was something older and more specific than that. It was the feeling of a thing done completely, of a promise kept to people who had not known she was keeping it. Outside her window, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta did in the early autumn, warm still, the trees not yet turned, the city moving in its ordinary way through an ordinary morning. Diana sat in it and breathed and let herself be still, which was something she had not allowed herself to be for a very long time. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page. There was still work to do. 1 year later, Diana Okafor opened a door. It was not a grand door. It was a standard commercial door, with a glass panel and a push bar, set into the ground floor of a converted building on Pryor Street in South Atlanta, in a neighborhood that had been many things over the decades and was currently in the process of becoming something new, not yet gentrified, not yet lost, occupying the uncertain middle ground of a community that was still deciding what it wanted to be. The sign above the door read, "Okafor Community Health Clinic, free and low, cost care for all." Below the clinic name, in smaller letters, "In memory of Dr. Joseph Okafor, 1938 to 2001. The door that was closed to him opens here." Diana stood outside on the morning of the opening and looked at the sign for a long time before going in. The paint was still fresh. The letters were straight. She had checked them 3 times with a level the evening before, which was the kind of thing she did when she was trying not to feel too much at once, focused herself on a measurable task so the larger thing could settle around her without becoming overwhelming. The clinic occupied 4 examination rooms, a waiting area with chairs that had been donated by a church on the next block, and a small administrative office that Diana used as a combination consultation room and storage space for the supplies that arrived in irregular quantities from donors she had spent 6 months cultivating. The equipment was second-hand but functional. The walls had been painted by volunteers on 2 consecutive Saturdays. The examination tables had come from a clinic in Buckhead that was upgrading its facilities and had been willing to donate rather than dispose. It was not much. It was more than nothing, which was what had existed in this neighborhood for primary care before Diana opened the door. Her mother was the first person through it. Clara Okafor was 61 years old and had retired from Piedmont, Atlanta the previous spring after 26 years of night shifts, and she walked through her daughter's clinic door on opening morning, wearing the same practical shoes she had worn to work for 3 decades, and carrying a casserole dish covered in foil that she set on the administrative desk without ceremony. "For later," Clara said. "You won't remember to eat." "I'll remember," Diana said. "You won't," Clara said, with the placid certainty of a mother who has decades of evidence on her side. She looked around the waiting room, at the donated chairs and the painted walls and the small framed photographs Diana had hung her grandfather in his nursing assistant uniform, her mother in her first-year nursing photo, a photograph of Thomas Bryson that Grace had sent, a school picture, the kind taken against a blue background that showed a man with his father's easy laugh and his daughter's precise eyes. "Your grandfather would have said something embarrassing," Clara said. "He would have cried, and then pretended he wasn't crying, and talked about something entirely unrelated." Diana smiled. "I know. I'm not going to do that," Clara said. "I know that too." Clara looked at her daughter for a long moment with the particular expression of a woman who has watched her child carry something heavy for a long time, and is now watching her set it down and build something in its place. He would have been proud, Clara said. He was always proud. But this specifically. She gestured at the walls, the door, the sign visible through the glass. This is the thing he spent his whole life wishing existed. The first patient arrived at 8:17 a.m., 17 minutes after the clinic opened. She was a woman of 71 named Eunice Patton, who had taken 3 buses to get there, and who had not seen a doctor in 4 years because the nearest sliding-scale clinic had closed, and she could not afford the co-pays at the urgent care facility, 6 blocks from her apartment. She had a cough she had been managing with over-the-counter medication for 11 weeks. Diana examined her with her mother's stethoscope, the one engraved with her initials on the bell, the one she had taken from her locker on the day she was fired, and listened to Eunice Patton's lungs with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 14 years learning to hear what charts did not say. The cough was bronchitis, not pneumonia, which was fortunate. Diana prescribed a course of antibiotics and a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks, and spent 20 minutes talking with Eunice about managing the condition and what symptoms would require more urgent attention. Eunice thanked her 4 times. Diana said once was sufficient, and Eunice said she had been waiting 4 years to say it, so 4 times felt about right. By noon, the clinic had seen 9 patients. By the end of the first month, the waiting list was 3 weeks long. Marcus Webb was named acting chief of the surgical floor at Memorial Grace in the reorganization that followed Aldridge's departure. He was the youngest person ever appointed to the role and the first black physician in the position's history, which the hospital's new communications director noted in a press release that Diana read with the particular feeling of a person who knows the distance between a press release and a policy change and is watching, carefully, to see which this one turns out to be. She called Marcus the evening the announcement came out. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Strange," he said. "Like wearing a coat that belongs to someone else. It fits, but I keep checking the pockets." "You'll stop checking," Diana said. "After a while it just feels like your coat." "Is that what happened with the clinic?" She thought about it honestly. "Not yet," she said. "But I think it's getting there." The new patient reporting protocol at Memorial Grace, implemented under Joint Commission mandate, went into effect in the same month the clinic opened. Under the new system, any clinical staff member could submit a patient safety concern directly to an independent oversight board, bypassing department management entirely. The submission was logged automatically with a timestamp that could not be altered. A response was required within 72 hours. Retaliation against the submitting staff member was defined as a terminable offense. The protocol was named, in the official policy documentation, the Okafor reporting standard. Diana learned this from Marcus, who sent her a photograph of the policy document with the name highlighted. She looked at it for a long time at her kitchen table, in the evening quiet of the apartment she had lived in for 9 years, with her grandfather's photograph in its frame and the notebook stacked beside her. She thought about the patient safety committee that had received her report and never followed up. She thought about Carol Henning telling her to sleep on it. She thought about the formal warning and the termination letter and the security guards walking her out of the building while the patients she would not be there for in the morning lay in their rooms down the hall. She thought about what it meant for her name to be on a policy that made those things harder to do to the next person. It was not the same as undoing what had been done. Nothing was the same as that. Thomas Bryson was still dead. Miriam Foster was still dead. Robert Calloway was still dead, and no policy and no settlement and no revoked license returned them to the people who had loved them. But the door was different now. The next nurse, who saw something that did not match, who heard, in Harriet Doyle's phrase, what the chart was not saying, would have a place to put it that could not be dismissed with a memo about unauthorized record access, would have a channel that created a timestamp the institution could not alter, would not have to carry it alone in a notebook in the pocket of her scrubs. Grace Bryson left the civil rights firm 6 months after the settlement and opened her own practice, specializing in medical negligence and patient advocacy. Her first case involved a family in Savannah whose elderly father had died after a nursing home, failed to report a medication error. Her second involved a hospital in Macon that had systematically understaffed its overnight nursing shift for 3 years. She called Diana before taking each case. "Tell me what to listen for," Grace would say. And Diana would tell her the specific things, the clinical things, the places where documentation went quiet when it should have been speaking. She would tell her what 14 years of listening had taught her about the space between what was written down and what was true. On a Thursday evening in November, the clinic's last patient of the day was a boy of 9 named Marcus, which Diana noted with a small private recognition brought in by his grandmother because he had been running a fever for 2 days. The fever was manageable. He was going to be fine. Diana gave his grandmother instructions and a follow-up appointment and walked them to the door, and after they left, she stood in the empty waiting room in the quiet of the closed clinic. The chairs the church had donated, the walls the volunteers had painted, the sign above the door with her grandfather's name on it. She thought about Joseph Okafor in his nursing assistant uniform, smiling in a photograph taken sometime in the 1970s, doing the work of a man with half his education for a quarter of his salary without bitterness, because Clara had said the work was the point, and Joseph had believed it before Clara had, and Diana had learned it from both of them in the particular way you learn the most important things not from being told, but from watching someone live it until it becomes true for you too. She turned off the lights. She locked the door. She walked to her car in the November evening, and the air smelled of wood smoke from somewhere nearby, and the neighborhood was doing what it always did at this hour, quieting, settling, the ordinary sounds of people going home. Diana sat in her car and opened her notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote the number of patients seen that day. She wrote a note about Eunice Patton's follow-up appointment next week and a question she wanted to research about a medication interaction she had noticed in an elderly patient's chart. She wrote the things that needed to be remembered. Then she closed the notebook, started the car, and drove home through the Atlanta evening, through a city that did not know her name and did not need to, past the hospital where she had worked for 14 years and been fired on a Friday and started, without knowing it yet, the longest and most necessary fight of her life. She did not look at the hospital as she passed it. She had somewhere to be. Diana Okafor did not set out to change a hospital. She set out to do her job. She wrote things down because her mother taught her to. She listened for what the chart wasn't saying because her first supervisor told her that was where the truth lived. She kept going after they fired her, not because she was extraordinary, but because she understood, with the clarity of someone who had watched her grandfather's door close, that silence was a choice, and she had already decided, a long time ago, which choice she would make when the moment came. The notebook is still there, in the archives of the Georgia State Medical Library, cataloged under Nursing Practice and Patient Safety, alongside a copy of the Okafor Reporting Standard and the Joint Commission's published findings. Any nurse, any doctor, any patient who wants to understand what one person's careful attention to what was not being said can do, they can read it. So here is what I want to leave you with. Think of someone in your life who kept going when every institution around them said stop. Who wrote things down when everyone else looked away? Who carried something heavy because they understood that putting it down would mean agreeing that it didn't matter? Tell me about them in the comments. I read everyone. And if Diana's story stayed with you, if you believe that what a person notices and refuses to stop noticing can change the shape of the world, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe, because the next story is waiting, and it belongs to someone just like her.